Hello, everyone. This is Free Domain Radio. We got the man here, Stefan Molyneux himself.
Yes, this is me, Stefan Molyneux.
Thanks so much for being here, Stefan. I'm so glad that you decided to come and debate us. I was touch and go there for a while, but we were able to set someone up. So
I have to follow the art of the argument to save Western civilization.
So, Stefan Molyneux,
Free Domain Radio.
when I first heard about you, I thought that my first thought was, I cannot believe the guy who made Black and White and Fable is MRA. Do you get confused with the...
That's Peter Molyneux.
Related to Peter Molyneux?
Yes, I am. In fact, everything I am comes from him, including my overpromise of ability.
Unfortunately, Stefan Molyneux, the real Stefan Molyneux, is a coward who will not appear on the Tech Wars podcast. But we have Nightmare Vision here, who sounds...
Hello.
Do you do a good Stefan Molyneux impersonation?
You know, I grew up in London.
Yo, you only had a 3-second video in preparation a minute ago. That was your only practice.
Do you do any other impersonations?
I don't even think I do a Stefan Molyneux impersonation.
I have my Al Pacino impersonation.
Yeah? Can we hear?
Yeah,
Can you grace the Tech War fans?
Okay, this is Al Pacino in Angels in America. Have you seen that?
No, have I seen it? I haven't seen Angels.
It's about like AIDS or something. I've never seen it. I've
compelling.
just seen this scene. There's a scene where he gives this big monologue, but then my version of the scene is, I'm gay, you're gay, the whole system is gay. And he's doing his condemnation.
That's really good. Yeah. That's really good.
I haven't seen an Al Pacino movie even, but I know that's good. I know that's accurate.
No, we have Nightmare Vision here really today.
My Molyneux is bad.
Not
how old are you? 30? You're 30 years old.
Stefan Molyneux
Your eggs are dying.
Are you still? Do you still live with your parents? You haven't tea food?
30 years?
30 years.
You have
That
zero
was my
eggs.
main introduction to him. Was when I first heard about him, it was like as a cult leader.
Yeah, those were all the articles in the main. He was like 2008. Google Stefan Molyneux, go to news on Google. And it's just all mainstream news articles, like the new cult that's trying to take your kids away from you, or like my horror story.
Because I think that he just
kid met Stefan Molyneux.
He had like a bad boarding school experience. I think that was like one of the only videos I ever watched from Stefan Molyneux. Was he was just talking about like how bad his parents were for like sending him to boarding school or something like that.
Should I start a cult? Is that the conclusion?
You know,
Someone sent me a website. I think there's actually a forum of former like members.
Oh, I'm sure that there is.
Oh yeah,
survivors.
Whenever
something like that.
That's like the main cult personality, though, is that when you're in a cult and then you leave the cult, like not being in the cult becomes like a cult. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've always seen that happen, and you know, it's the same with
Scientology.
That's people say that about your alma mater, when you're
the
Waldorf schools.
Waldorfs, yeah,
they like
to
a
do
Nazi
that.
cult.
The weirder thing is the people that say that Waldorf, and I forget what the anthro whatever the thing is called, that they accuse of being cultish.
Anthroposophacy.
Yes, their accusations and their like actions of crying out about it, and the websites they make and the communities that they have for it are way more cultish than any kind of Waldorf experience
So I
I've
imagine
had, I went to a Waldorf school.
It's the same thing for people who got out of the Free Domain Radio cult.
Yeah, it's like you become, and I've seen it happen with, if you follow the Scientology people, that guy that was high up in it, Marty Rathburn, who does all I almost said Stefan Molyneux, the Louis Theroux documentaries about, or that Louis Theroux movie about.
Oh, I saw that. That was really good.
Yeah, and he like has like this moment where he like snaps, and he was like super high up, and him and all these other survivors in quotes have like a more of a cult than they almost originated with from their original cult that they base around surviving.
I've always noticed this about former cult members.
Yeah, just Google
Marty
Marty
Rathburn.
Rathburn.
They have a cult mentality, like it's in their brains already.
It's
so like no
similar
matter what
to-
they do, it like ends up being a cult to them.
Yeah, I think it's similar to general addiction, where when people discover that they have an addiction to something and they want to stop, they usually can't just go to doing like nothing. They have to kind of supplement with a different addiction. You see that a lot. Like, like I've known people that have been like wrestling with like alcoholism and drug addiction and stuff, and then when they kind of adopt new lives that are filled with like they're healthy, but they're still like equally compulsive things. Like it could be exercise, or it could be like church groups and things like that. They start filling their lives with kind of equally obsessive behaviors, and you don't say anything because it's like obviously superior to what they were doing before. So, if you've been defood and now you're on a forum complaining about it, and you no longer believe in the art of the argument, it's better than whatever else you were doing.
Is it better than actually following Stefan Molyneux, paying $1,000 to go to his conference on women?
The women's conference. Yeah, what is that?
We're gonna sell tickets to come to Warren's apartment for $1,000, and I don't know. I'll give you a lecture about how to be a good woman. I mean, come on. We can do better than Stefan Molyneux. We'll set up Warren's apartment. We'll get a little lectern, and all the women on Twitter can come to Warren's apartment.
No, the best.
We'll give you lessons on
how to be a real woman.
We'll bring in all the wannabe like trad e-girls, and we'll have them give like cooking lessons and you can dress up in a
boot camp.
In a trad suit.
Trad wife boot camp.
Trad wife.
Now you guys want to make sure that this pastry comes out of the oven completely raw. The best part about there's probably lots of best parts, but the best part about the ads I saw were the little blurbs for
each presenter.
Yeah, each presenter, like Cortez and Molyneux. Like Cortez, it was like 50 million women are in love with him because of what he can do, and you're just like,
is that the guy with the long hair?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
This guy with the long hair.
I don't know much.
And you were just saying before about how he followed the whole thing where he's working out, and then he has like his step-by-step entry into like giving more and more life advice, and then becoming like a guru.
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier. This is what the red pill means in like its specificity. Like people use it as like a kind of silly cliche for like general right-wing, politics and like transformation. But there is like a real red pill trajectory that's like just totally parallel to that, where like guys like him and others, Molyneux's one of them, where like people start with like one thing that, like in his case, it was like exercise. I think he was talking about like how to do push-ups and pull-ups correctly and like go to the gym. And then all of a sudden that somehow turns into like how to manage money and like telling you to cut all the toxic people out of your life in 2020 and stuff like that. And then all those like long threads on how to be a man, and like then like you get another 10K followers, and now it's a long thread on how to be a woman. And then you do the convention thing, and then it kind of adopts like this kind of like it's almost like a simulation right-wing politics. Like it's like, like they probably have a lot of things about soy boys and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like
it has like its own natural rhythm that it follows of how you.
Yeah.
And like Cernovich used it.
Yeah. He's kind of like an OG, like in a way, like he kind of like originated a lot of that. He did a good job.
He invented that career path.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that's so original about him is that I think he didn't use exercise. I think he just used like
game.
Yeah.
Like how to pick up girls.
I think it was transsexuals. Either that or was his skin condition. I'm actually not sure.
It was his
Don't quote me on either of those.
His bloated arms in the Dead Sea, soaking his sores.
Don't even bring that up to memory. I don't want that image like penetrating my consciousness. At this particular moment, I can't really handle it.
You don't want that inside of your gorilla mind? Set?
But then at one point, I remembered he was selling nootropics.
Oh, yeah.
And what was
it literally called Gorilla
Mind?
Mind.
It was called Gorilla Mind.
It's called Gorilla Mind. They were blue pills, too. Apropos.
Wow.
Little blue pills.
These guys also, I mean, they like to sell the problem. So I think that's where, like, a lot of the need, they need to create the need for, like, self-help. But, like, the most basic kind of, like, ridiculous self-help that you can imagine. Like, I feel like they like, create this need, so they just go around and they troll, and they say, you're not a real man like me, Stefan Molyneux. I have a wife and a kid.
I want to know what your problems look like, where, like, your first guesses and answers, like, I need a nootropic.
Apparently, Stefan Molyneux is pissed because his viewership is declining, and he's been posting about that.
No, I didn't know
and he's
that.
like, I don't know how can I get my engagement up?
Is it because Lauren Southern left?
But no,
She
Stefan,
retired from being racist.
we got hundreds of converts from Free Domain Radio over to Tech Wars after they saw how you chickened out like a coward.
How dare you? How dare you?
What
That's
kind
not
of
the art the
figure?
argument.
What kind of leader is that? That just leads their pack into
Into the den
Amazon,
of wolves, into Tech Wars, into the Tech Wars fandom.
But no, I did not
Completely
I didn't violate the
unguarded.
NAP, so it's okay.
Imagine like the
voluntary.
alpha wolf leading the entire pack into a den of the alpha sheep leading into the den of wolves, and then that alpha sheep just says, "Fuck this! I can't do this debate. Here's my book. Here's my Amazon link," and then runs away and leaves all the other sheep to be.
I'm off to say Western
Consume.
We
civilization.
need this is why I wanted to do a show. I wanted to do a real knowledge information show, and to talk about science of philosophy, philosophy of science, with Nightmare Vision, because you've been posting a lot of like tweets about it.
Yes,
And I
have.
just keep seeing your tweets. I'm like, yeah, damn straight.
Yeah, that's the kind of engagement I'm wanting. I want that kind of emotional resonance with my dry philosophy posting.
Because this is what Stefan Molyneux, one of the big things that he does is it's all about logic. That's
Yes.
what the YouTube atheist Redditor people,
Libertarian,
yeah,
same thing.
And I'm always saying this, but that's not like all that rhetoric is.
No.
It doesn't make any sense to me. You can't say that logic and argument is the entirety of rhetoric. I mean, when you're engaged in an online space in an argument with people, I mean, you're engaging in
Yeah, but I mean,
something more than logic.
The classical trivium was logic, grammar, and rhetoric, and even in the Western canon, you want to call it that. But you'd have writers like Cicero that were studied for rhetoric, and not to say they were like illogical or anything like that, but it was it was an art that was valued in and of itself, and it wasn't just limited to him. You had a lot of Western figures like that, and so the idea that you see that a lot with like the fallacy, like the kind of Reddit atheist thing where like everyone's committing a fallacy and it just totally invalidates everything you're saying, and like I think that generally Twitter has kind of been good for that, encouraging people to understand that like logic is important, it's essential in a way, but it's the art of human communication is much wider than just like this kind of I don't know, almost like robotic.
That's how you end up like Ben Shapiro.
These
No,
fallacies aren't
no,
really fallacies.
That's how he presents himself, right?
Yeah,
Even
yeah,
when he
yeah.
is not being logical, it's this kind of grating presentation that like it's kind of like just the facts, and it's just the facts. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
How many cookies? 6 million, whatever. It's like that's his whole thing is like that he almost like a lot of conservatives and libertarians actually do this, where it's almost like they've taken themselves totally out of the argument. It's like pure logic. Like you know what I mean? Like you can't really oppose them. It's just the logic of the
and
argument.
then the fallacies that they talk about. I mean, it has nothing to do with like constructing like a syllogism or anything.
No, I don't think they teach any of that.
They also abandon morality pretty often in favor of logic in that libertarian community, and that's how you end up with the pedo problem that's often associated with.
Oh, I'm sorry, Warren. How long have you been against freedom?
But they never have any of this like actual discussion of logic. I mean, we're talking about real logic at this point. This is why we need to get into some discussions of
Yes, we do.
philosophy of science, because I posted on New Year's about how the New Year isn't real. And it's like Neil deGrasse Tyson always, whenever it's like Neil deGrasse Tyson and it's a holiday, he always posts something like, "This has no astronomical significance," he said. He always posts
January 1st has no astronomical significance.
See, you do good impersonations.
That's literally just like generic happy black guy number one, man. The universe don't be like it is, but it do.
Fuck your Christmas.
Oh man.
But because I'm always interested in how Neil deGrasse Tyson, he always says that like philosophy of science is like bad.
Yes, he's actually a great example. I mean, it wasn't intentional. We were just bringing him up to joke around because he does do that. I don't know if he did it New Year's Day, but he does always post the New Year's Day.
I've seen interviews with him where
he's.
he's said specifically like, he said condemnations of like philosophy of science and said, it's better not to ask like too many questions. I
Yes.
think he said one time.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is a kind of indirect popularizer of, I guess, the kind of new atheist trend that kind of waned, to be honest, over the past few years.
Because they all tried to make their tradition to be like Sargon and to like get into the
Yes, it kind of lives on in kind of characters like that in a way.
and Stefan Molyneux.
Stefan Molyneux,
But like that used to be such a core thing. I remember back from like my earlier like online experience, and then that sort of has died out because I remember like that's if you went back and like watched Sargon videos or something like way back in the day, that's like the core thing. And then
the rationalist skeptic YouTuber.
Because I don't understand the way that specifically they're rationalist because like
They don't either. They don't either. No, like, I mean, there's a lot of like pretentious stuff about like they don't really know the terms that they're using. They want the pretense of being the only person in the room employing logic, which is kind of like logic's kind of basic to the human experience. Like not to say it isn't special in its own way and it can't be studied, but it's also pretty basic. Like to act like you're the only person in the room that like is logical because you know what I mean? Like it's so ridiculous that like anybody, even people who aren't very intelligent, still meet like basic standards of logic when they speak. It's not that impressive of a feat.
But with this like Neil deGrasse Tyson and these like the atheist logic people, I mean they describe themselves as rationalists, but like in like a philosophical point of view, I would say rationalism is like something they don't actually believe in because like if you're a rationalist, like you believe that like there's probably not other minds that exist, and that you think that like all of reality is probably just a projection of your reason.
Well, they don't. I don't.
Which like seems like something they would not want to admit being.
Yeah, no, it's not.
But that's what like I would call that's what rationalism is from like a definitional.
It's a totally valid implication. I mean, like idealism is not something that they probably have any real awareness of because you can. I mean, without like doing like a deep dive into them psychologically, you can tell that this impulse is really driven by the desire to have like pure fact. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like that's what they want. That's the whole impetus behind the rationalist skeptic approach and the Neil deGrasse Tyson and kind of like the scientistic approach is to style yourself as like someone presenting just pure logic.
And that has really carried through Gamergate and things. Like all the Gamergate videos, like whenever Thunderfoot or somebody like that would make
he's a huge one, yeah.
Make something about like Anita Sarkeesian, it would be a 5-hour-long video where it's very structured, like point by point, fact by fact, debunking Anita Sarkeesian. She says that there's not enough women in games. Here are the example of the female characters in games. But it's like such a basic bitch kind of like way to to refute something because it has no like cultural understanding of like what this would be about. It's just like
he could be including women in games of that with like their pussies out or their tits out. That's completely what Anita Sarkeesian's talking about. But he's not looking for the moral or actual idealist point. He's not. He's just talking about it in pure robotic logics. So he's like, here's a woman. This is still a woman. It doesn't matter.
Which is bigoted, by the way.
Because they want something to fall back on. I think like it comes from like some sort of insecurity that is like built in to these people. Because these were like the kids in high school who just like quoted Monty Python back and forth to each other. Like that sort of like person who then goes on YouTube and it's like, what do I believe in? And then they just look around and they're like, well, I believe in logic too and reason. And
that's an ad hominem.
Yeah. So they like to have that something concrete they can fall back on because they just think that like whenever you say it's an ad hominem, that like totally shuts everything down and like, the argument stops and it's like you lost. This is logic. It's ad hom.
Yeah. If you're listening to this, you should have already noted. I mean, Warren mentioned Ben Shapiro earlier, but you should note that this is the entire conservative and libertarian approach to politics. By the way, like this is it. If you pay attention to like pop conservative stuff, all they do is talk about how like liberals have no logic. Like they're just illogical. They're just like emotionally driven people. And like we're the ones that have like the logic. Mm-hmm. And the logic is, like a very low tax rate. Like that's logic.
Like that's like, why is socialism bad? because
It
you
just
know, it's
doesn't
a
work.
completely economic argument, like price theory, like Planner's problem. You know, free market is more efficient at distributing goods. Like they see it from like a completely economic perspective, like, and they don't engage with any humanistic arguments about socialism at all.
No.
They completely, you know, you could say that would be a big part of like what Marx originally wrote about. Was he had like a whole humanistic streak to him, and he's like, you know, he thought that a lot of the economic things that were going to happen, that those were inevitable, and that those were, you know, market forces working out. Like he wanted to position himself in the tradition of like Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson and David Hume, and like he wanted to be a scientific economist who was predicting that, you know, the market forces would go in this direction. But he also had like that whole humanistic streak, especially in all of his early writings, that's like we're going to have like a spiritual revolution in humanity, and it's going to make the need for markets and for money, that's going to evaporate as a consequence of like a philosophical, like moral transformation of like human souls. And so you get the people like Ben Shapiro and shit, and they're coming in and just attacking it from like, you know, there's bread lines in the Soviet Union. And it's like, that's not a convincing argument to me as someone who knows anything about Marxism. Like that doesn't refute what, because you can argue that like, you know, the Soviet Union never really became communist. You know, they went into the 20th century. They had just, you know, gotten rid of feudalism. They had no heavy capitalist, you know, industry or anything like that. And their whole goal was to just like build up the capitalism that Marx thought was necessary for communism to happen. So looking at it from that, you know, you can argue around someone like Ben Shapiro so easily if you know anything about it, but they just like want to stick to this, you know, socialism. You know, there was the purge, Stalin purged the people, and that's where all these fucking like neoliberal, neoconservative people originally came from, is that they were like pissed off, you know, idealists about Soviet communism.
Trotskyists.
And they, you know, then got turned off by what Stalin was doing, and then they became like conservatives in the United States.
Irving Kristol, he was the one, I think he said that like a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. That really just meant that he had his his own like left-wing Soviet aspirations dashed. That's what he really meant.
Because I'm an economist. I know these things.
Yes.
I've gone to the top schools in the world for economics, and I've studied with many Nobel Prize-winning professors.
You studied directly under Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and
so they're just approaching, like, whenever anybody like Ben Shapiro or Stefan Molyneux, and they talk about libertarianism versus socialism, I feel like the arguments are completely hollow because they're not based on any theoretical or philosophical moral perspective at all.
No, and on top of that, just to tie this back into the discussion that you wanted to have, you know, using people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, is that you see this on the internet still sometimes. People use the phrase like feels over reals. Like I've seen that before, and like it's the idea that like any argument that can't be reduced to ultimately like a mathematical or statistical model is just emotive. It's your just emotion. It's what you happen to be feeling. It's irrelevant. It's not scientific. It's not objective, right? It doesn't have a universal applicability and also a universal understandability where like everyone can access it, right? It's just what you feel. And that's ridiculous. That's not valid, right? That's not logical. And so everything has to be reduced to that type of argumentation that you've just been like deriding and mocking and stuff. And they believe that, but then ultimately, like, you know, as a separate point, like in the real world, human motivations are complex. And so just because you style yourself as like prizing that over other things, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win the day. Like lots of other things factor in to like what motivates people to adopt certain like political positions and sympathies.
Because we can talk about like there being different kinds of science.
Yes.
And there is like a mathematical science that exists within like a very particular realm.
Yes.
And this is where like the philosophy of science, I think, is important because like it sketches out like what this sort of realm what its actual like parameters are, like what its borders are. But like only certain concepts apply within this realm. So things only exist in a certain way as they relate to like causality or substance.
Yes.
And like beyond that, like we can't say anything about them. And it's not that like we can't know the thing in itself. This is what I always feel like people don't really get about Kant, is that they think he's like making some sort of like challenge to say, you know, you can't know the thing in itself, so you have to like, can you solve this challenge? Can you like, people, that's how always they want to interpret it, where they want to like go beyond the boundary of everything and like get at the secret knowledge.
The noumena.
Yeah, but then it's like, I feel like
Fang noumena.
Kant is just saying that like you can't know anything about it because knowledge beyond the realm of like possible experience is meaningless.
Yes. Yeah, people do misunderstand that. Like, Kant's trying to say that this is actually just built into, on his epistemology, how humans know things. It's not like a challenge. It's not a challenge to get beyond it. It's part of the very notion. It's in the concept of knowledge itself. What it is to know things is to know them in this way and not in that way.
And that's all that you can say about it. But then there's like, you know, his whole point is that there are things beyond that, like an idea. Like when he talks about noumena, it's like he's talking about like a generalization of like a thing.
Yes.
Like an idea of a thing, which is like an infinite, you know, possibility space of like everything that could be categorized under that thing. So to know it is meaningless because it doesn't have any specificity. It's not determined within any kind of reality. So you can't know those ideas in of themselves. But, you know,
That's interesting
using science. So it's like, that's like what all these science people and the Ben Shapiro types of arguments is like, they don't admit that there's like another mode for discussing or like thinking about things beyond how they exist in the particular way with reference to like our ability to know them.
Yes, and that's part of the, again, not to keep picking on Neil deGrasse Tyson, but
no, he deserves it.
But no, like it's not just him; it's people, it's others too. Like I said, the new atheist phenomena. You had people like Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss and all these other type of writers, and even Sam Harris. He's one that's like pretty popular, and I think a lot of people kind of internalize this, that for knowledge to be real, it has to be this like kind of empirical, mathematical model of knowledge, and if it's anything other than that, then it's just it's immaterial. It's, you know, like I said before, it's just like emotive. And so one of the problems with this is that the people who adopt this position end up kind of becoming, and they adopt an anti-philosophy position. And the way they understand nature starts to get just reduced to this mathematical, scientific method. And so that means that they have to kind of in an a priori way say that there is, like you said earlier, there is no other mode of understanding nature that can yield any knowledge. And so they level the, you know, they level the way in which humans know things. And so you're kind of stuck arguing, you know, with them on these terms. And then they'll ask you to say, okay, now, given these terms, prove such and such and such. And you look at like the history of, you know, Western philosophy and literature and stuff, and you realize, well, I can't, given the parameters of the game that you've just laid down. And then they'll look at you and they'll be like, checkmate. You know,
this is why we need capitalism. It's just proven it to you.
It's the free market of ideas.
It's like sitting down to play chess and then like white goes first and then black just reaches his hand over and knocks over your king physically. And he's like, well, I mean, if you read the rules, your king did fall, so I win, buddy. Sorry.
Well, yeah, can we do kind of a little bit of a dive into like philosophy of science?
Yeah.
Okay, just so, let me just put it like, to put it briefly, right? Like, and this kind of gets into like some of the stuff I've been tweeting about and reading about, and you have this idea of modern science, and you do see this adopted very popularly by people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and other you know, quote unquote thinkers. That, you know, the world is kind of very superstitious, and it believed in all these crazy things like religion and God and the human soul and right and wrong, you know, really insane things like right
just
and wrong.
folk mythology.
Yeah. And we know now that the age of consent is just a social construct. And then, yeah, exactly. And then at a certain time, we have this scientific revolution, and we have all this knowledge that comes through the use of this kind of, we'll call it the scientific method, this kind of like empirical, metrical method of understanding the world, which really is like a quantitative understanding of the world. So like for a shorthand, I'll just call it like mathematical physics. Okay. So mathematical physics becomes not just like an avenue for knowing the world, right? Like it becomes like the avenue. Like if you look at like Descartes, like I think the real translation of a discourse on method is like a discourse on the method. In other words, that, when Descartes starts his project, he's trying to understand the method for attaining certain knowledge about anything and everything, right? And
this is what like all the rationalist philosophy was just
exactly.
Like them all just using Descartes' method to just do something else.
Yes.
So then this became the big problem, is that basically you could use Descartes' method to say anything. And so you had people coming in who were like, Catholic anti-Enlightenment people who were then like constructing their own rationalist Descartes systems, Cartesian like systems of philosophy that were used as like to be counter-Reformation, and got all kind of fucked up in that way, which ultimately leads to like rationalism being like super nihilistic at the end of the day, which is what like everyone eventually realized.
Well, what you have is like these kind of twin dangers from my perspective, let's say. So everything I'm going to say now is coming from like my own perspective regarding some of these issues and studying them. You have these kind of twin dangers of materialism, which is like, I think implicitly very popular nowadays. But then like what you mentioned earlier, idealism, which is also like an equally valid conclusion from these ideas. In other words, that we ultimately can't have access to anything outside of our own mind. And a lot of these people that are like, that kind of fetishize logic fail to realize that because of their philosophical illiteracy, that idealism is an equally tenable approach to, just like materialism is, given the shared philosophical assumptions that people make. It's totally legitimate and rather powerful if you do share these core modern assumptions.
Yeah, I feel like people have sort of written off idealism like in every aspect. Like none of these logic people would ever think about describing themselves as idealists in any sense. But they do have that like, if as a rationalist, that's their core problem, is that actually it turns out they're idealists in the end, and then they turn into nihilists. Or like, if you're a new materialist or something and you're basing yourself around like, post-Marxist like materialism, it's like you don't also realize like how actually idealist that is in a certain sense. So like everyone thinks that like idealism has been like defeated somehow, but it seems like the danger is that now everyone thinks that they're like totally within this logical realm and dealing entirely within like material terms, but then at the end of the day, like they're lapsing into like this weird idealism and they don't realize it.
Well, the interesting thing that you just said is that, they believe that they're increasing their knowledge of the world by becoming more and more logical, but logic is an art of the mind, right? Like logic isn't something that exists in physical reality. It's not a material thing, right? It's a mental process. And so there's a kind of double movement, which really gets into the general problem of something like, mathematical physics styling itself as the only way to understand reality. So this goes back to like ancient philosophers and stuff like this. But ultimately, the way I would put it in kind of a simple way is like this. You have a choice where you trade the ability to understand the world with certitude, right? You trade that for an ability to understand a certain amount of physical reality. And that's what some of these, like modern thinkers don't want to admit, that something like mathematical physics will give you a great amount of model applicability and certitude, but it's within a very specific realm. And the way they get around that is by trying to say there is no realm outside of it.
I think
it is everything.
People also, they get into their minds that like the universe possesses kind of like a finite amount of possible knowledge. And they think that like the purpose of science is just to go and like extract the knowledge, like they're drilling for oil or something. And they're going to just, pump the well dry and get all of the knowledge. but they don't realize I feel like you could make an entire system of science that was equally valid to what we call science, but was based around an entirely different set of, conceptualizations.
Gertian science.
No, that's true, because the entire scientific endeavor has you want to say half and half, but it has a huge injection of human art into it.
Mm-hmm.
We, in many ways, I don't want to go too far. I don't think that it's totally detached from the physical world and sense experience. It's not. But with that said, in a large way, our scientific knowledge is like a knowledge that is reflecting ourselves back into it. And then we forget that by not understanding the philosophy behind it, and we start to take it for granted. And that's when you get into this position where people just kind of have this scientific understanding, like everything we know is just a pure reflection of objective reality. And like, that's why we have to use logic and science and a model and math. And if you're not using that, then you might as well just be like a crazy person rambling on the corner. Like, in other words, the things that you say, if they don't reflect those things, they are totally void of content, any type of meaningful content.
And this is what never makes sense to me, is the people who really want to extract all the knowledge out of the universe, is that I feel like Kant actually disproved that was possible, because you have all these scientists today. Like, the big thing is they're all searching for the quote unquote theory of everything.
Yes.
And they think that there's, they're going to find the mathematical formula that unites everything, and it's going to be really simple and neat. And I feel like, Kant actually, he disproves that. He disproves the possibility of a theory of everything. Isn't that the point that he makes with antinomies?
Oh, yes, yeah. I
think that he makes, because there is a very specific point where you need an idea to generate science. Kant just defines a space that he calls possible experience, and that's where science takes place. But he doesn't sketch out a list of things that space includes. It's a conceivably infinite possibility set of everything that you could basically think into existence. Our concepts for things don't exist within the universe, they exist within the mind. And so we use our concepts to divide up reality into all these specific things, but those concepts aren't native to reality, they come from us. So it would be possible to conceptualize more and more phenomenon into existence by through that process of conceptualization.
Yeah. Okay. So let me buttress you bringing Kant in. Let me bring in Aristotle really quickly. Okay. So if we want to look at the kind of Aristotelian Thomist understanding, which when it comes to knowledge in terms of mathematical science, mathematical physics, does have some overlaps with Kant. You have the mind works in let's say 3 degrees of abstraction, right? So in the first degree of abstraction, you have physical science, the science of nature, right? We would call physics, in the broad sense. Right. Then in the second degree of abstraction, you have mathematics, right? And then the third is metaphysics, okay? Mm-hmm. So you want to break those down. Let me just break these down according to 2 different criteria, okay? The criteria is the way they exist and the way they're known, okay? So for physics, right? Physics requires sensible matter to exist, and it requires sensible matter to be known. So, okay? So in both these criteria, you want to check off both boxes, okay? Metaphysics does not need sensible matter to exist, right? And it doesn't need sensible matter to be known, right? This is kind of on the traditional kind of scholastic schema. You're talking about the separate substances, God, right?
Forms.
Yes, exactly.
You're talking about 3 specific things. This is ultimately how Kant defines, his idea of metaphysics. He has general metaphysics, which is ontology. Yes. Which is just the existence of things in general. But then he also categorizes special metaphysics. The whole point of Kant is doing this in a very scientific way by logically exhausting what is possible to philosophize about. And so he comes up with special metaphysics as consisting of the study of like the soul or like the immortality of the
Yes.
soul, the study of God, and the study of like providence or like the
Yeah.
causality of the universe or like the structure of nature.
So now tying into your point about how we can't really find this grand unified theory of everything. It's in principle impossible. It's not just something that is put off indefinitely. It's something that we suspect is just not going to happen given the parameters of modern science. We come to the second degree of abstraction in between physics and metaphysics. We have mathematics. Mathematics does need to exist in sensible matter, right, in order to be. But it doesn't in order to be known. That's what makes it special. And that's what makes it so tempting for humans to want to use mathematics in order, we kind of retroactively apply it to our physical science, right? In order to understand the world. Because, you think of something like a line, like a mathematical line, right? Something like that can only exist in reality in an approximation of like a physical line, right? But there is nothing in the physical world that has the kind of perfect exactness of a mathematical figure, right? Like you can see triangles in nature, but you're never going to see like the definitional triangle in nature, right? That's what makes mathematics different. See, like when I was talking earlier about the way that things exist and the way things are known, in physics, both the boxes are checked. In metaphysics, they're both left blank. In math, one is checked, one is left blank. So what I'm trying to say is that makes mathematics this special category, right? Where ultimately you still are referencing sense experience, right? You have to reference like back to the experience that you have, just like physics. But it doesn't need to be known as existing in a physical object. In fact, that's not how you know mathematics properly, right? In order to really understand like a triangle, you have to abstract it away from all the physical experiences of triangular things that you have. That actually affords you a true understanding of it. So in a way, it's untethered from our experience, right? Which frees it up for us to kind of, the way I would put it, like play with it conceptually, coming up with all these dialectical structures, right? You apply this to physics and it starts to, obviously it yields dividends like immediately, right? Because now, but also the other thing that makes it so attractive to us is that mathematics is the most connatural knowledge to the human mind, right? It's this general, logical, exact way of understanding the world, right? Physics is really hard. Like learning the nature of animals and stuff, that could take you a lifetime to do, right? And metaphysics is also really hard, right? Aristotle says it's like a borrowed knowledge from the gods. Like we're not even really supposed to have it. We're not supposed to understand things like God and the soul and these things, but we do because there's something kind of divine in us, right? So that leaves mathematics as this kind of special way where it's like, once you have this entire field of knowledge deduced from a few simple axioms. And that's like what you were saying before, with this like grand unified theory. It's really tempting to us because it's the easiest, it's the most human way
and this is
to
like
understand things.
Specifically, this is what the critique of pure reason is like literally about. Is that people, I think there's a weird thing where like the critique of pure reason is like a great book or something, and like if you look at the great books of the Western world, like they had like the complete critique of pure reason in there, and like there's like nothing there that's like you are like gaining insight about. Like it's not like a self-help book. It doesn't have like any literary or like emotional value whatsoever. It's like when that book came out, like no one read it, and then Kant had to write another book called the Promegenia to any future metaphysics in order to explain what the book was about.
That's what I read first.
Same, yeah. Same.
So it's like that's what I would say that everyone should read. Just
Yes,
don't
definitely.
go through the whole critique of pure reason unless you like read this sort of book first, because he's very clear about like what the whole point of the book is. He says is like, how is mathematics possible? How is like natural science possible? And like, how is metaphysics possible, like if at all?
Only real red pill philosophers can read the Critique of Pure Reason. Just
feel
leave
like
it to the Molyneux and the Cortezes to read something as dense as the Critique
we should
of
have
I
got.
feel
Pure
like you
Reason.
hold that up to Ben
Molyneux.
Shapiro or Stefan Molyneux, and it makes them burn like a vampire
I
with
wanted
a
to read
cross.
Stefan Molyneux's like master's thesis or whatever. It's out there somewhere. Someone sent it to me, but I haven't.
Is it on the
looked at
welfare state? The welfare state. Well, the interesting thing is that I generally think about these things in Aristotelian terms, and you generally think about them in Kantian terms. But what's interesting about this is that there's an overlap in an interesting way. It's a difference in time and history, right? Like Kant, like notoriously, he says that like Hume woke him out of his like dogmatic slumber, right? Because, he was adopting this kind of naive rationalism of thinkers like, Christian Wolff and, this is all influenced by, thinkers like Descartes. And then Hume comes, this kind of radical empiricism.
I love Hume.
Right, yeah.
We're the pro-Hume podcast.
Just a Matt Scott.
People don't really realize how
I'm
like
anti and
woke,
pro-Hume, it depends.
woke pill that Hume was about everything.
No, they don't.
I remember they put Hume in my philosophy 101 like when I was first studying, and they I just was attached to it.
Was this at the Waller School they had?
No. But I was really like, man, this guy.
I can't imagine he would ever allow Hume to be taught to children.
And I'll never forget my first Hume video. It was a Molyneux video, free domain radio. It was excellent. It gave me everything I needed to know. And then a few Cortez tweets
I stopped
about
talking to my parents.
the history of it.
I got really into Hume. I stopped talking to my family.
I defood them when they didn't want to burn down the library that contained metaphysical knowledge. But what's interesting about this is that, so Kant...
Because I think that Kant is like, he's, not like, he's an everything from Kant follows Aristotle pretty closely, I think.
Well, I mean, yes and no, but...
in terms of how he's defining, his whole idea of like how metaphysics is like taken exactly from Aristotle, like his division of different kinds of sciences.
Well, I would say that the interesting thing is the motivation there. So Kant wants to avoid rationalism and the empiricism of Hume, right? Because Kant recognizes that science cannot survive this kind of like withering Humean skepticism and empiricism, right? So Kant wants to say science and metaphysics.
Because what Hume is really saying, this is how Kant actually defines it, is that he says, there's three different kinds of idealism, and he says there's dogmatic idealism, which he says is like Descartes and Spinoza, and any sort of rationalist philosopher. And then he says there's problematic idealism, which is just a Hume. And then he says that there's transcendental idealism, which is Kant. And so he's saying that like the whole point of his philosophy is like, and this is what is the weird thing about Kant that like I think that most people don't realize is that he's trying to basically save reality from rationalism.
Yes,
is exactly. That he thinks that rationalism basically destroys the need for having any kind of reality, and that you basically are just end up trapped inside of the mind, and that like rationalists can't assert the independent existence of reality from our thoughts.
Then it falls into that makes it easy to fall into scientism, like a culture of scientism as like a theological societal construct.
Such the problem of like modernity is like this is exactly one time I had a friend in college, and he was kind of like this annoying guy, but I remember I talked to him a while later, and he was talking about reading like Richard Dawkins.
Okay.
And I was telling him that I was like interested. I was like reading like German Romanticism, and he's saying that like, well, how do you explain that like nihilism comes after Romanticism? Like Richard Dawkins like showed that like Romanticism leads to nihilism, but like that I think that's like if you're like a skeptic atheist YouTuber or something, that's the narrative that would probably make sense to you is like Romanticism is about like emotion or whatever, and they don't want logic. And so that would lead to nihilism because like people don't have objective logic anymore. But then like the way that it actually happens in history is that like you have rationalists like Descartes who end up destroying reality because they want to know everything through reason, so they get to a point of not being able to believe that like other people are conscious.
They're evil neo-Gnostic fucks.
No, but this is really the crux of the problem, and it doesn't begin with Descartes. This is an ancient philosophical problem too. It's ultimately the problem of universals, the problem of knowledge, and the danger is that if you don't solve it, you can stay trapped in your own head forever, and you can't philosophically get out of your head into the real world. And you can't when you ask yourself, how is it that the things that I have in my head somehow constitute knowledge of the world, you have to be able to give an answer for that. And if you can't, you are stuck inside of your own head. You're stuck with your own ideas. Everything is just ultimately mind, your mind.
And so the whole point of Kant is that he's like trying to step in to this process of like rationalism just devolving further and further into like not being able to know anything.
Yes.
And then he's trying to step in the middle of that and like save reality. And that he basically fails, like German idealism basically fails in the end. And then, nihilism.
Until Trump.
Until Trump. But this is like...
Trump is a Kantian!
Because if you like actually, at the end of the Propaganda, Kant is like very specific that like science can't end. And he's like, you need to have an idea of like the universe in order for science to work because, you need to be able to generate like phenomena against that idea. Like that's how the human mind like creates realities that, there's a spot of something that you don't know or like you can't, that you use to generate like everything that you're studying in science basically. And so like science can't end because it can't reach that idea because it's an infinite thing. So science can expand infinitely to know an infinite amount of possible things. And I think like Goethe says this too, and like his writing is, he makes a point about how there's always going to be like new phenomena that come into existence with new ways of measuring things.
Yes.
And so I feel like this is like the ultimate problem with like, we're going to use the particle. So I make the joke that like
The Higgs boson
subatomic
doesn't
particles
exist.
like don't exist and shit. But I think that's the real problem is that, that's not going to end anywhere. That's just that's the proof that I need in order to see the flaw of science is that you can say, oh, there's atoms, then the atoms are made up of something, and those are made up of something, and those are made up of strings.
And now we know
like,
about quarks.
And it's like, well, what happened where the strings come from? And then they're going to, they're just coming up with an infinite number of new ways to basically dig down deeper and deeper, but they're never going to reach an end point of that.
So, okay, let me come at it now from the past. If Kant wants to come at it from the future relating to like Hume and Descartes, let's say, it's rationalism and kind of skepticism, let me come at it from thinkers like Aristotle, St. Thomas, who kind of, I would argue, initially avoid the errors of thinkers like Descartes and Hume. So Kant wants to save philosophy from their errors, right? And so another approach, like the kind of way I'm interested in this stuff, is by looking at thinkers who kind of just preempt their errors and just didn't make them in the first place, right? So St. Thomas, he defines, and John of St. Thomas too, who was like kind of an authoritative figure afterwards, he defines mathematical physics as a scientia media, right? So physics is a science, mathematics is a science, right? Mathematical physics is dialectics, meaning that it is not, sorry to say, it is not actually a science in the technical, like Aristotelian use of the term, right? And so what does that mean, dialectics? Well, just to put it simply, it means something like probability. You're not dealing with universal, necessary, certain knowledge. But the thing is that now if you're someone like, Neil deGrasse Tyson, right, or Richard Dawkins, right, this hurts. This is killing you, right? I'm just telling you that you're not actually doing science. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But the problem is that it was the error in assuming that you were following the only way of understanding the world, right? And so, if you think that this is the only real way to understand the world, telling you that you can't find some grand unified theory that explains the entire universe in like just a few simple mathematical equations at their simplest, it's going to dash all your hopes, right? So the way to fix that is to just recalibrate your understanding of how humans know things. And the way you can do that is by realizing, right, that something like mathematical physics is a special kind of dialectical art where physics is being subalternated to mathematics, right? I know it's kind of weird. And that means, well, in a nutshell, I'll put it like this. I use the phrase in one of my tweets of a mathematical limit. So if you want to imagine it like you have a polygon, right? Like let's say you have a pentagon. It's like a 5-sided figure, right? And you have next to it a circle, okay? You want the pentagon to become a circle. How do you do that? You keep adding more lines to it, right? So then you have 6 lines, it's a hectagon, right? Then it's a heptagon, then it's an octagon, then it's a nonagon. Eventually you have a chiliagon, right? It's a 1,000-sided figure. Now, that's not a circle, right? That's not a circle, but now, has to be admitted, it's closer than a pentagon, right? It's still not a curved line. It's still ultimately just a series of straight lines connected to one another, making a polygon, right? This is how, like, a kind of analogy for St. Thomas and John of St. Thomas is understanding of what we call modern science. It's a limit, and that's why it can't ever understand everything. It is a many-sided figure, like a polygon. With each advance of knowledge, with each scientific revolution, which, by the way, that's built into the very notion of science, like you said earlier, the constant revision, right? Because, again, I told you earlier, mathematics is, it's like untethered from reality, and it's partially a creature of the intellect, right? Even though it does ultimately require reference back to sense experience, you don't approach the limit. That's the whole point of a limit, the mathematical limit, right? Like if you use 2 as a limit, right? All the numbers in between 1 and 2, how many are there? It's infinite, right? You go 1/2, then a 1/4, then a 1/8. And so the point is that you do progress in science, but you're never going to attain the limit, right? Because that would entail a contradiction. You're never going to get to 2. The difference in science between, like, you know, the number 2 in science is that we don't actually have a coherent picture of our number 2. In other words, we don't have a finished picture of reality.
And knew this like 2,500, how long ago? Like 2,000 years ago?
That, like, what's been lost from science, because I also want to talk about alchemy. And
of course.
Well, no, I think that this is a very legitimate thing that people don't often take into account, is because you have the traditional picture of, like, you know, we didn't always have chemistry, and we had the alchemists, and they were doing like some basic chemical experiments, but without really understanding them. And then, like, you know, science got better, and we realized that the alchemists were, like, you know, that stupid, and now we have chemistry. But I feel like that's not actually historically accurate. Like, I feel like alchemy was about much more than that. Alchemy was about, like, an idea of, like, having an encyclopedia of knowledge, having a synthetic picture of, like, all human knowledge, like synthesizing all branches of different sciences together. Like, I feel like that's an alchemical idea that, like, that's where, you know, science comes from, is that, like, that idea didn't go away as being part of science.
No.
So, but I think that, like, this is where, you know, these modern scientific approaches fail, is that they've lost the ability to synthesize all the different knowledge into, like, a meaningful picture, because there's no art to it.
Yes.
Like, I think that there's, like, way more of a connection between art and science than is typically admitted. I feel like, you know, science is in part an artistic act, because when Kant is talking about, like, mathematics and, like, natural science, you know, it's tempting to read that on face value as, like, natural science as in, like, empirical sciences, but that's not exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about natural science as in, like, nature philosophy, and, like, sketching out, like, the actual parameters of, you know, what science can know. And he's not talking about, like, chemistry. So all these other kinds of science, like, of chemistry, biology, and stuff, they are, like, a lesser, like, bastard form of, like, knowledge.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Yeah.
This is what's interesting, is that this sounds like, you know, I guess it could sound like this, like, you know, some self-styled philosopher trying to say, I'm actually the only one who knows anything, and everyone else is just, you know. But the truth is that if you look at the history of science, and what makes this ironic, even at the pivotal moment when you have these brilliant thinkers, like, approaching relativity theory, right? In other words, this kind of a revolution where they're overturning the kind of established preeminence of, like, Newtonian mechanics, right? It's at this very moment, in other words, when science is discovering something that they think is now really going to give us a key into understanding reality, that you have writers and thinkers and scientists like Arthur Eddington and Max Planck, and even Einstein to a certain extent, but I would say most especially Eddington, who are totally aware of the limitations of science. Like, in other words, you have thinkers like Eddington who are, you know, studying things like, you know, redshift, and, like, in other words, like, in their time, right, the most advanced form of, you know, physical scientific discovery available. And then they would retire to just writing about it. And then they would proceed, and Heisenberg too, thinkers like Heisenberg, they would write about basically what we're talking about now, how like measurement is kind of a human art, and what we're doing is kind of a human art. Like Eddington has a great passage about how like, you have an elephant sliding down the hill, and you can turn this into a bunch of pointer readings where, the hill just becomes like this frictionless surface of an inclined plane, and the elephant becomes a random quantity of mass. And you can do all of these things and turn the entire experience into a series of pointer readings. And you do understand something about this elephant sliding down the hill when you look at it like that. I'm not, you know what I mean? It's not like you don't understand it at all. But you are compromising the actual experience of an elephant sliding down the hill when you understand it in this purely quantitative way. So in other words, you're trading the total picture for a partial picture that gives you much more certitude. And you had scientists that were talking about this. So it's not as if, it's a war between like philosophy and science. Like Eddington was a totally competent scientist. He was totally aware of what was going on in his day. And yet he had this kind of, I guess you want to call it like an epistemic humility regarding the endeavor. He was aware of the level of like art, like you said, like the artistic input. In other words, the degree to which this is partially a construct of the human mind. Not to like, get lost in subjectivity, but that is actually a part of it.
Because this is like, the only way that Kant defines science is he just says it's like organized knowledge.
Yeah.
And so this is like what the Romantics ended up doing is, seeing this as a metaphor or a connection to artistic creation is like what's a novel, but just like an organization of like information. Like it's an organized complex of like different characters that you may have gotten from like, reading the newspaper or like people that you've met. That's what the author does. He has all these little bits and he just organizes it into a system that follows like, the form of a narrative, which, they see this narrative like as a form of like artistic judgment that you could compare to like scientific judgment. And then it's just like organizing different knowledge. So like in the way that a syllogism produces knowledge at the end of something, a narrative judgment that you'd find in like a book or a novel is like an equally valid sort of like scientific form of judgment, but you're not getting scientific truth out of that. You're getting a different kind of truth, but it's one that is on like an equal plane as like scientific knowledge.
That's interesting. The other aspect I would also add to this is that it's built into the very scientific method to be partially constructed by human art. So the very idea of like a hypothesis. What you're doing is essentially choosing one side of a contradiction, right? And so it's in the very notion of choice. It's in the will. And so in other words, it's yet another thing that makes the endeavor of modern science the type of thing where it will just yield indefinitely to like further revision, further human input, further construction.
And this is how like Goethe talks about it, is that a scientific theory is like just a collection of experiments.
He actually uses a great analogy of the scaffold on the building of nature. And the scaffold is like our science. And you can just kind of like totally envelop the house in the scaffold, but the scaffold still can never become the house.
Because all you have is these, experimental reference points, and then the human mind is filling in the connection between them.
Yes.
But this connection can never be found to actually exist within nature itself.
No, and let me also say one thing that even though I sound very critical of certain interpretations of what the maximum amount of knowledge modern science can give us, I do think there's an inevitability to some of this in the sense that, like I said earlier, that like mathematics is the most connatural form of knowledge to the human mind. It's something that like we want to jump on, but even when you look at Aristotle talking about like the categories, right? He starts with substance, right? And then these 9 accidents, right? But one of them is quantity. And quantity is kind of like the first accident. It's kind of like preeminent. It's the closest thing to substance. And so just to paraphrase, like summarize this like as clearly as I can, quantity gives us the phrase you would use is homogeneous exteriority that science wants to understand the world around it. In other words, it makes everything the same according to one mode.
So, I mean, what Aristotle is doing is that he's basically like, and what's interesting about this is that it's all really based on language.
Yes.
Is that this is all Aristotle is doing is that he's coming up with these categories basically based on like what sorts of predicates are possible to like use in sentences.
Mm-hmm.
So he's making like a point, like he's trying to make a list of like, we can make judgments about things. We can say that like the car is in the house, in the garage, and he's saying like that's place, and like that's a predicate that something can have, and so he's trying to come up with the most general way of categorizing all of the different predicates that there are into a list of like predicates, and that's exactly Kant's basis for like his table of categories.
Yeah, there's a real similarity. Yeah,
I think that like that table, like Aristotle did not complete like a table of predicates. He just like tried to come up with one, and then like it got refined in the Middle Ages into a more standard set of them.
Yes.
And then Kant came in, and I think that like he considered his major contribution was infinity or something. He wanted to categorize one of the types of categorical judgments as like infinite. And he thought that like that wasn't done before. So he's sort of like has this thing where he's perfecting the table of predicates and like basing all of science around that. So you're basically saying that like here's how things can exist in the sense that we can like make a linguistic judgment about them into a sentence and say this thing is this, and then there are 12 different kinds of this at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like the basis. So it's all really rooted in language, which is not like, a natural fount of logic. I mean, it's a human creation. Yeah. So ultimately, things can only exist to us in a certain way based on, our ability to like categorize them in a sentence.
Yes.
So this is why Ben Shapiro and Stephen Molyneux don't understand.
This is why you can't be libertarian.
Yeah, they need to debate.
I hope we proved our case here, guys. I mean,
someone needs to send this to someone needs to clip this and send it to Stefan.
I think we've like, thrown down the gauntlet against Stefan Molyneux.
And all rationalist, skeptic people everywhere. Anyone who thinks they know anything, you come on Tech Wars. You come on Tech Wars. The art of the argument. Saving Western civilization.
I wonder what that book is about. Someone needs to like buy it and send this to us. Someone needs to buy us the Stefan Molyneux Art of the Argument.
Read a review of it. Tear that apart next. Just his source of it.
And the subtitle of the book is like Saving Western Civilization.
They all have that. That's part of that's part of that red pill trajectory that they're all like, they all have this really existential import for their ebook.
I mean, do you remember that like old picture of like Mount Rushmore? And it had like Sargon's face and like Stefan Molyneux's face.
I think Milo was another one.
And it's like the little kid asking the father, who are these men, Daddy? And then the dad says, these are the men who saved Western civilization.
The Ben Garrison cartoon.
The worst part about that is it's going to happen. Like, we're just going to have to watch that. That's going to just materialize one day.
But like, I feel like Stefan Molyneux is that people don't really have any sort of deeper understanding of like what Western civilization entails.
No, I mean, some of these guys just think it just reduces to the NAP or like voluntariness or something like that. Some sort of like, see, that's where it gets into the logic thing. They think that they can deduce morality in like the same kind of axiomatic way that like you would deduce like Euclidean geometry. And that's, that, I mean, not to get into it, but that really does tie into the general like history of liberal politics, where in a lot of ways you can characterize liberal politics as like the political application of like 18th century Newtonian mechanics to like human society, because like I mentioned earlier about Descartes wanting to find like one method of certainty. That really was the craze, and that really was like a huge impetus behind political liberalism. And when you see like conservatives and libertarians today, they aren't the only ones, but they are kind of like the bastard stepchildren of this same. In some ways, they're kind of the direct inheritors. You'll hear it from them all, their own mouths. They'll say like, "Oh, I'm a classical liberal." Like Peters, I'm a classical liberal, and like you'll hear it from them. and it's partly following this kind of fetish for achieving this degree of like scientific objectivity in things like politics and morality, and just getting to that. Like
you can see this in like the Constitution and like Constitution worship.
yes,
Is that that's a very rationalist thing, because the whole premise of the Constitution is that you can like form an ideal like organization or like system of government and have it mirrored, like basically derive it from like the structure of rationality.
Yeah, this is something that is always bothered me about like right-wing politics since Trump. You have all these people that like, it kind of became popular on like right-wing Twitter to like mock the Constitution, to say, at least I still have the Constitution, and as like, while the whole demographics of your country changes and like mass immigration and things like that. And people look at you like, oh, this is all just like white supremacy and this is all just racism. Meanwhile, the argument is kind of just basic. It's like, content matters. You're trying to tell me that the structure is the only thing that matters. And not only that, they can't even establish, by the way, how the Constitution somehow structures the country. Like, they refer to it as a kind of ideal structure of what the country should be looking like and ought to look like. But all the real argument you're making is that there's really no political association that can be wholly determined by, like, the founding charter. Like, that's kind of a ridiculous notion when you think about it, just in and of itself, regardless of all the political baggage that you get accused of having when you bring this up. It should be kind of a basic point.
Because there's no, like, I mean, really our system of government is just based on precedent. And, I mean, there's no point in, like, having any sort of argument otherwise. I mean, when the Constitution first, like, came out, like, there was no precedent for interpreting it. So there was, like, nobody knew whether or not, like, the Bill of Rights applied, like, only at a federal level, or like if it superseded like what the state
all
could
these
do.
fights started right away, like right away. Even whether to include the Bill of Rights in the Constitution was itself, like, that wasn't something unanimously agreed upon. You read some of the anti-federalists.
But then I feel like this, libertarian like constitutionalism, is ultimately just this rationalist proposition about, how the ideal form of a government that's like fit for man is like really found purely within the structure of reason, and like has no relationship to any sort of historical reality.
No, and some of this stuff, for anyone listening, this stuff could
like
sound
free
like
speech.
That's an excellent example. Like, some of this stuff sounds like it's heady, or like we're trying to be like intentionally like obscure or something like that. But you really pay attention to someone like Ben Shapiro. Like, go look even at the YouTube videos, like the blurbs on the side. It's like, blown out by facts and logic. Look at what Ben Shapiro does, this 10-year-old libtard. And you just see that, like, there's this drive, this, like, impetus to, like, be the only person. And I've had this discussion with people that were self-styled conservatives, liberals, leftists, Marxists, libertarians. It really doesn't matter. It's like this, it's kind of a generalized tendency today where, ultimately this person wants to say, like, hey, man, this is just, everything I'm saying is really just like 1 + 1 = 2. Like, how could you oppose it? And that, like, if you look at someone like Shapiro and like others, like Molyneux too, especially Shapiro though, it's like their whole gimmick, the whole shtick is like that they have the monopoly on logic, and everyone else is just like saying totally meaningless things without content. When after this show, I hope we've established that they are truly the only ones saying anything without any real content, because they are literally obsessed with a kind of formalism where content is seen as totally meaningless in every and all cases.
Yeah, this is important stuff. It needs to get disseminated heavily through the channels of.
How did you read?
This needs to be on.
Yeah, we need to
on Vox on
this
how.
This is why Stefan Molyneux,
the niche podcast that destroyed cult leader Stefan Molyneux,
by showing that facts and logic.
You can't destroy an idea.
What is it? The critique of pure logic, I guess.
The critique of pure grifters.
But it's like strange that there's also such a logic to like the rise of like any one grifter. It's like, they follow this self-help pattern that has its own like logic to it.
It's the only science that I'm interested in. I need to,
because
I want to do it
Like,
myself. I hope to grift one day.
In a template, basically, that needs to be like prearranged for them. Like, it has to be like, here's how you become the e-grifter. You start out, you give fitness advice, then you move into like, the template has to be there for them to like in order to latch onto, which is why like this Steven Crowder people, and they all do so well is because they just provide like a template that people can wield
Yes.
when having like an argument with, somebody that they don't like.
Yes, that's like a huge part of it. Shapiro does the exact same thing. How to win an argument against, so-and-so, whatever, in any circumstance. Like, blow out your family on Thanksgiving using these,
Here's the
Steven
template.
Crowder literally sells those templates from the Change My Mind things.
Yeah.
He's reading them out of a binder that you can see him flipping through, and that's kind of the whole point. The whole point of Change My Mind in that series isn't to like isn't to disseminate these arguments, but actually to sell to grift his pamphlets. Honestly, he says it like, oh, and by the way, like every 5 minutes, like, by the way, at louderwithcrowder.com, you can buy these, buy the fucking mug and this pamphlet on how to destroy socialism when they bring up New Zealand. And
it's such like a weird substitution of like setting yourself up and being like, I'm the philosophy master, I'm the logic master. I've come up with the perfect arguments that you need in order to explain why everything you don't like is bad. Here, I'm going to just sell you these preformed magic tricks from like a magic shop. It's like, amaze your friends. There's snakes in the peanut jar. And it's like,
it's a really good analogy,
if you want to
actually,
get this reaction, use this trick from my trick shop.
But what's so good about that analogy is that it really does illustrate the illogical and irrational nature of the whole endeavor. Because, right, like, they're selling you a kind of parlor trick, but the parlor trick is not meant to win a logical argument. It's meant to wow the crowd, right? And that's what the Change My Mind thing is about, right? That's what all the debates are for. Like, even debating is kind of funny, but it's like the idea is that, I think people have internalized this at this point just from Twitter. I think they've touched the hot stove enough where they realize that debating is not for the sake of your opponent, it's for the sake of the people watching, I think Taleb taught all of Twitter.
which is rhetoric.
Yes, exactly.
Which is not fully based on logic. I mean, you also, there's 3 parts to rhetoric. There's, pathos and ethos and logos.
Yes.
So just trying to reduce it down and act like logic is the only component of it is, the major grift at the heart of the whole thing.
Yeah. Because really, ultimately it hasn't worked.
Really you're trying to like give people a logical template they can use, but you don't give them the tools that they need to make like a actual argument.
No, that would be actual philosophy.
That would be actual philosophy, which is like what they don't sell. So it like contradicts their whole self-style thing of like, I'm going to teach you how to, be as good as I am at philosophy. When really they're just selling you the preformed magic tricks from their stupid magic shop.
Yeah, and it plays into the emotional needs of people, which, again, is kind of ironically illustrates.
Mostly college students who are in these environments of, having their classmates who are usually leftist or socialist or whatever, and they want to destroy but like, you can't come up, there's like no creativity there. There's no magic, there's no art to it.
No.
And this is why, I'll ultimately have to poo-poo the whole thing is that, like, it should be like a fun thing that you employ creativity in the process of doing, and that's how you really like make people think about things and change their minds. If you just give them this like this like pre-wrapped argument, it doesn't advance any sort of like public discourse about it.
No, and even though I don't really, I've never considered myself liberal in any real way, like culturally or politically, but at the same time, when you look at this kind of cottage industry that conservatives have and libertarians have, you don't really have any sympathy for them when liberals just give these like easily available objections to some of the things they say, because you realize, well, you bought your argument at the store, like it went bad.
It is the ultimate commodification of arguments.
Yeah, and it's funny. You bring up college campuses. It's to a much lesser extent impressive, but Charlie Kirk does this same exact thing. It's just you don't really think of him like that because, say what you want about Shapiro, like Kirk seems to be like orders of magnitude less impressive rhetorically than Shapiro, but ultimately he's really doing the same thing. And this should explain. I mean, economics and politics aside, like. I fully believe this 100% explains this weird obsession that these people have with like concepts like socialism and stuff like that. What they're not really articulating a philosophy or a political position that's like historically contextualized. They're really just trying to say illogical. They're trying to say irrational. Charlie Kirk gets up there and he has some graphs about how like, oh, well, or like Shapiro, like I don't watch them, but like something like the Laffer curve, like actually libs, as corporate tax rates go down, tax revenue for the government goes up, and you're just supposed to be like so wowed that like, oh my God, this is like Modus Polens in my class, bro. This is crazy. I'm gonna all the libtards. And you sit there and you're just like, that's what they mean when they say like quote unquote socialist or liberal. What they really mean is like someone who's objecting to this argument that they think is functionally equivalent to like a math equation. And how could you oppose that? You know what I mean? Well, you buy my book and you find out.
And the other thing about them is that they have like no literary culture, like at all. It's like
wait. Ben Shapiro wrote Bullies, okay?
The trajectory of all these.
I have a copy of Bullies.
Oh, Abigail Shapiro.
Yeah, I do. I never read like past 2 pages, but I wanted to see what it was about.
No wonder you can't argue.
It's like the trajectory that these people are on is like it has no like ambition outside of basically just selling an argument.
Have you even heard Abigail Shapiro sing classical music? Where are you?
Why do you think I bought Bullies? That's what sold to me. I was. Didn't she block you?
Yeah, she blocked me. No.
You brought up her nose job, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know she got one.
I love you wherever you are.
I thought the old nose did look better. I mean, I wasn't trying to be mean. I was just trying to tell it like it is.
No comment.
I can't believe
I'm simping. I'm no comment
she
at all.
put me through that. Broke my heart.
No, but you are right about the total dearth of culture on their side. It's like a noticeable, I guess from our perspective, it's like one of the most noticeable things about their entire like ecology or whatever. I noticed it like almost right away, but
it just goes in this, specific direction that they all want to follow, but it has no like, cultural significance. It has no like, we're going to like make like, Mike Cernovich, he's going to make movies or something, and it just ends up being like trigger warning. Like how libs are destroying the Western civilization.
All conservative grifting products always have that. They have the inflammatory one-word title.
Yeah.
And then the colon. And then this huge mouthful. Like, end of discussion. How libtards are crushing speech on college campuses and raising the corporate tax rate on Amazon.com. And what, you should oppose it and vote for Mitt Romney. You're just like, here's $12.99, Regner E. Like,
that's why your argument, Compound, on why Marx is the true libertarian. That's like the anti-magic magic shop, magic trick. Like, walk in and buy it. You can't do that. That's like a creative argument that makes people actually think. Because
and you can like actually make up your own and like say whatever you want.
I'm not familiar with doing that. I'm on Twitter. Excuse me. We don't do that on Twitter.
You can't be beholden to Ben Shapiro preformed arguments.
No.
Is that I feel like that doesn't like really enrich the cultural experience.
You need to enter into a space where you can do anything as long as you have like the tools to do it from like, primary sources, like a domain, but like a free domain that you need to, that's like, you need a free domain to really exist in the correct way in this type of environment.
I want somebody listening to this, I really want someone to make like a Max Headroom video and like get Stefan Molyneux's face on Max Headroom and have him saying free domain radio.
Freedom of radio. Your eggs are dried up. You're 30.
If you're a Tech Wars listener, please waste all your time making this terrible video of Stefan Molyneux as Max Headroom, and it would really make my day.
You'll be given the top comment in the comment section of this.
Think about the retweets.
There's no comments to this.
No, we have the comment section down below. Leave your comment. Let us know what we should talk about next in the comment section down below, and leave a like too.
But I guess we'll wrap this excellent episode up here, and then I think Warren.
This is the greatest episode of any podcast that's
yeah,
ever
we
been
The
recorded.
Rationalists destroyed.
We did everything, absolutely everything.
We're going to have some more episodes coming up. Warren is going on vacation to Paris, so we're going to have to when
I'm going
Warren
to
gets
fight
back.
the good fight with the yellow vests.
You're going to have to give us updates about that, but we're going to record 4 or 5 shows in the next week, so there's going to be a bunch of new content coming up. So everyone,
They'll be uploaded.
I can't wait.
Over the
stay tuned.
yeah.
And thanks
Nightmare
for
Vision. Thanks
being
for
here,
coming
Nightmare
on.
Vision.
Oh man, this was great. This was great.
Everyone should follow you. What's your exact on Twitter?
You can follow me at Twitter at God Close My Eyes, and if you follow me for a little while, you'll understand why that's my @. You'll be replying that same exact phrase back to me as you see the levels of cursed content that I will produce specifically for you at God Close My Eyes.
And you can follow his alternative account at Stefan Molyneux.
Free Domain Radio.
Free Domain
Your
Radio.
eggs are dead.
This
You're
is
30.
Free Domain
At the wall.
Radio signing off.